One of the key functions of Spring Security is to help determine when particular methods on our controller should or should not be invoked. So if we have a controller and we have some method, and we're going to call this our upload video method again, we need to be able to establish the identity of a client like a mobile device that's sending an HTTP request to the server. So if this client's sending a request, we need to have Spring Security sitting here so that it can figure out, based on the request, who the session is, who the session that's been created from this client is associated with, which user is associated with this client, and have they established a session, have they logged in or done something else to establish a session. Now, a really important piece of that is if Spring Security is going to look at the requests and decide whether or not a session exists, and if a session does exist, who the user account is associated with, Spring Security has to know about your user accounts. So the way that Spring Security does that is with something called the UserDetailsService. And this is a simple interface that you can implement if you want to create your own user details or some way of storing user accounts. It's simply an interface that allows Spring to look up a user by name. So if you think about this, if a client goes and tries to connect to some protected method like upload video, and they haven't established a session, Spring is going to redirect that client to some login mechanism, typically a form-based login for web clients. And then the user is going to go and type their username and password into that form and send it back to Spring Security. And Spring Security is going to go and look up, based on the username, the appropriate information about that user's account. So when the username comes back in, Spring Security is going to call whatever user detail service has been provided to it and ask it to look up that user by the name provided in the lookup form, in the login form or whatever mechanism they were using to log in. So Spring needs to know, based on the username, I need to find the account associated with that particular user. And then that account information should have their password or a hashed value of their password or something else that Spring Security can go and verify to ensure that the person that's trying to log in really is that user associated with that account. So the user details service is the part of Spring that provides that notion of user accounts. So whenever you're trying to log in, and this doesn't have to be HTTPS, this does have to be HTTPS, but this doesn't have to be a form-based login. This could be something like basic authentication, which is another way that you can do auth with HTTP. Or it could be some other mechanism. But the key thing is Spring needs to know, how do I take a username or some other identity and find the account and the information about that account associated with that identity. And so it has a name-based lookup mechanism provided by the user details service. So if you want to create your own mechanism for providing account information to Spring, you need to go and look at the user details service and implement the user details service. And all this does is it's an interface that has a single method to go and look up a user by their name, and you simply return a user details object. And this is an object that has some important information. One, it has their name. So when you do a lookup, you should get back the user details with that same name. It has password information. It has some information about the validity of their account, so their account isn't locked or anything like that. And then finally, it has a field in here that you'll want to know about, which is called the list of granted authorities. And what these granted authorities are is if you go and add like @pre-authorize or something else onto your methods in your controller. So if you say at pre-auth, and I'm just going to abbreviate this, and you're looking for the role user, and we'd have has role as an expression there. Granted authorities, you are basically saying granted authorities, one of the entries here is the user role. So these granted authorities are basically different authorities or roles that have been associated with this account that then you can go and check in things like at pre-authorize. So when Spring goes and sees a request, it'll automatically handle the login process, talk to your user details service that you create, find out the appropriate account, and then you tell it which of these granted authorities or roles that are associated with the account are part of that user. So when a request comes in, it can go and look at the method that the client is trying to invoke, look up their account and say, does the security expression that you're specifying here, like has role user, match up to the granted authorities in the account? So this is a way of providing sort of attributes or information about what are the capabilities of that user's account.